Before the name China. You know, sometimes I think about how many footsteps must have pressed into this earth before we ever called it anything. Long before the word China meant a country, or even porcelain people were already carving symbols into bones and watching the river flood the same way it always had. The land we now call China has seen more than 4,000 years of stories. Dynasties rising and falling like waves, philosophers and emperors, farmers and poets, and always people trying to make sense of the world around them. My grandfather once told me that you could spend your whole life reading Chinese history and still feel like you missed a chapter. So tonight, I want to take you through some of it. Not every detail, not every battle, just enough to feel the rhythm of time, like the steady current of the Yellow River. Close your eyes, settle in, and let me tell you what I remember, what I've read, what I've heard whispered through old films, dusty books, and quiet nights on the porch, with someone who once knew someone who had lived it. Ready, let's begin. The Cradle of Civilization, Shang, and the Bones That Spoke. I remember watching a documentary one night back when cable still had those static-filled channels that only worked if you smacked the side of the TV. There was this image of an ancient turtle shell, cracked in half, with strange markings burned into it. And the narrator said, "This may be the earliest known writing in Chinese history." That stuck with me, because that shell came from a time when people weren't yet calling themselves Chinese. They were just people living by the river, watching the seasons change, wondering why some years the crops grew and some years they didn't. So they asked the ancestors, and they asked the sky, and sometimes they asked the bones. Let's go back way back around 2100 BCE, if the legends are true. That's when the Xia dynasty is said to have begun. Now, whether Xia was real or not is still debated. There's no hard evidence. But stories of Yu the Great, who tamed the floods of the Yellow River, are etched into Chinese memory, like bedtime tales, passed down through generations. Yu didn't fight the flood. He redirected it, dug canals, let the water run its course. Some say that was the first lesson of Chinese civilization. You don't conquer nature, you learn to flow with it. Then around 1600 BCE came the Shang dynasty. And this one, we've got proof. We've dug up their bronze tools, their jade ornaments. And yes, those turtle shells and ox scapulae, what they called oracle bones. Priests would heat them until they cracked, then read the fractures like messages from the spirit world. Those marks. That's where the Chinese writing system began. Imagine that whole dynasties, rising families, praying wars being fought, and it all started with someone asking, "Will the harvest be good this year?" and burning a question into bone. The Shang were master metalworkers. Their bronze vessels weren't just for decoration. They were used in rituals to honor ancestors, to connect with forces unseen. They believed the dead still influenced the living, that if you wanted your crops to grow or your army to win, you had better stay on good terms with grandma, even if she had passed centuries ago. They lived in walled cities. They rode in chariots. They kept detailed records on bones, no less of eclipses, floods, even toothaches. And they worshipped a high god named Shangdi, believed to rule over heaven. But they also had their darkness. Shang kings kept power through fear. Sacrifices, human and animal, were part of their rites. Slavery was common, and their obsession with omens sometimes led them to paranoia. Eventually, as with most dynasties, their rule began to crack. By around 1046 BCE, a rival clan from the west, the Zhou, rose up, led by King Wu. They claimed the Shang had lost the mandate of heaven, a divine right to rule, and that the gods now favored them. That phrase, mandate of heaven, would echo through Chinese history for centuries to come. Every time a dynasty fell, the next would claim it was because heaven had withdrawn its favor. It was a clever way of making rebellion feel like destiny. And so, the Zhou began their rule. But that's a story for another night. Tonight, as you close your eyes, picture those early days. Rivers snaking through misty valleys, smoke curling up from thatched roofs, the clink of bronze against stone, and somewhere in the distance a priest holding a cracked bone up to the fire, asking what tomorrow might bring. Because before there were empires, or philosophers, or great walls, there was just this: a question, a flame, and the hope that something, anything, might answer back. The mandate of heaven. How power became divine. It's funny how people across history have always looked for signs. In the sky, in the stars, in the way a tree leans after a storm. But in ancient China, they found a way to make those signs official, to give power a moral backbone. They called it the mandate of heaven. Now, I first heard that phrase from my old college professor, a wiry man with wild hair and a soft spot for green tea. He used to say China didn't invent divine right, but they sure made it poetic. Let's go back to 1046 BCE, right after the Zhou clan overthrew the Shang. The Zhou weren't just stronger militarily, they were sharper storytellers. Instead of saying we beat the Shang because we had better weapons, they said the Shang lost because heaven no longer favored them. It was elegant, and it gave their rule legitimacy without needing to boast about bloodshed. See, the mandate of heaven wasn't a one-time blessing. It was conditional. If a ruler governed justly, heaven would support them. But if they became corrupt, or tyrannical floods, famines, rebellions, those were all signs that heaven was withdrawing its mandate. In a way, it was an ancient version of checks and balances, not from a constitution, but from the cosmos. And it worked. The people believed it. Because when your crops fail, and your river floods, and your taxes rise, you want to believe there's a reason, that the suffering has meaning. Under this new doctrine, the Western Zhou established a decentralized system of feudal states ruled by loyal relatives or allies. Each local lord paid tribute and pledged military support to the Zhou king in exchange for land. But as you might guess, handing out power to distant cousins doesn't always go well. Over time, the Zhou kings became more ceremonial than powerful. The real authority shifted to regional lords, each carving out their own domain, like little warlords with royal permission. The Zhou court in Haojing near modern Xi'an began to lose its grip. Then came 771 BCE, a year etched into Chinese memory like a scar. Nomadic invaders from the west attacked the Zhou capital. The king was killed. And although the dynasty technically survived, it was never the same again. The royal family fled east to Luoyang, marking the start of what we now call the Eastern Zhou period. And that's when things got complicated. From 770 BCE to 256 BCE, China wasn't really one unified nation. It was a collection of feuding states, each claiming the mandate, each eyeing the throne, each watching the skies for omens. Historians call the early part of this era the Spring and Autumn period, named after a famous chronicle kept by scribes of the state of Lu. And let me tell you, there was nothing poetic about it. States waged endless wars. Alliances formed and broke like tides. But amid the chaos, something extraordinary happened. Philosophy was born. This was the age of Confucius, who taught about respect duty and the importance of harmony, not just in the heavens, but at the dinner table. It was also the age of Laozi, who wrote the Tao Te Ching and urged people to follow the Tao, the natural way, like water flowing downhill. And Mozi, who believed in universal love and legalists who believed in strict laws and harsh punishments to maintain order. In the West, this period might have been seen as dark and divided. But in China, it became a golden age of ideas, a time when warlords fought with swords and sages fought with words. And still above it all loomed the idea of the mandate of heaven. Even the most brutal rulers still paused to consult the skies. Because in China, power wasn't just about force. It was about virtue, about timing, about knowing when heaven was smiling and when it had turned its face away. So, as you drift off tonight, picture a lonely court astrologer staring up at the stars through a narrow window in a crumbling palace. He's seen omens before, but tonight something feels different. A comet streaks across the sky. He bows his head, and 1,000 miles away, a warlord sharpens his blade, because heaven, it seems, is about to choose again. The Warring States. When China became a chessboard. You ever sit in a room where everyone's polite, but you know deep down they all want each other's job? That was China during the Warring States period, from around 475 BCE to 221 BCE. The land that we now call China wasn't a country, it was a chessboard. Dozens of powerful states played moves and countermoves, forming alliances and stabbing each other in the back. They built walls, dug moats, hired spies, and always, they were watching the throne. There were 7 major players by the end, the so-called 7 warring states. Names that still echo in history: Qin Chu-Chi, Yan Han Zhao, and Wei. Each one claimed legitimacy. Each one claimed the mandate of heaven. And none of them wanted to back down. This wasn't chaos in the streets. It was organized ambition. Armies became professional. Bureaucracies expanded. The art of war turned into a science. And speaking of the art of war, this was the age of Sun Tzu. No one really knows if he was a single man or a collection of strategists. But the book, The Art of War, became the ultimate manual for power. It taught that battles were often won before they began, that deception was better than strength, that sometimes the best way to win is not to fight at all. The Warring States era was a time of incredible cruelty and breathtaking genius. There were iron weapons, massive fortresses, and military reforms that would make modern generals take notes. But there was also philosophy still guiding the hearts of men, even as their hands reached for swords. Take legalism, for example. If Confucianism was about harmony and ritual, legalism was the opposite. It said, forget about morality, people respond to fear, to rules, to punishment. A well-run state, they argued, should treat citizens like gears in a machine, replaceable, functional, controlled. And one state took this to heart more than any other: Qin. Tucked in the west, near what's now Shanxi province, the Qin were once considered backward by their eastern neighbors. But they had something the others didn't: discipline. They built roads, reorganized their military, promoted based on merit, not family. And most importantly, they listened to legalist thinkers like Shang, who laid down a ruthless blueprint for national power. While other states got tangled in tradition, the Qin streamlined everything. They taxed aggressively, drafted ruthlessly, and punished severely. But it worked. Slowly, methodically, they gained ground. Meanwhile, the other states tore each other apart. Chu was rich and cultured, but spread too thin. Qi had brilliant thinkers, but too much internal politics. Yuan was isolated. Zhao and Wei kept getting caught between the others. One by one, they began to fall, not just from Qin attacks, but from their own infighting and bad decisions. It's like watching a long, slow game of Risk, except with real lives, real kingdoms, and real blood. By the late 3rd century BCE, the chessboard was almost empty. Only a few pieces remained, and the Qin were closing in fast. But here's the wild part. This wasn't just a period of endless war. It was also a time of unprecedented innovation. Thinkers from every school of philosophy debated in public forums. Engineers built irrigation systems. States issued standardized coinage. Writing became more unified. There was even the early idea of using census records for tax collection. It's as if the pressure of competition forced every state to evolve faster, think sharper, and act bolder, or perish. There's something hauntingly modern about that. You can imagine a scholar in Zhao drawing diagrams by candlelight, or a general in Chu standing on a ridge, calculating the best time to strike, or a minister in Qin, drafting another harsh law, believing it will save the empire. And above them all the sky stayed silent. Heaven, it seemed, was watching, because it had watched for centuries, watched the rise and fall of kings, watched philosophies clash like swords, watched a nation carve itself out of chaos, and soon, very soon, it would choose again. So tonight, if you drift to sleep with the sound of distant drums in your ears, know this: the war is almost over. But the real empire is just beginning. The rise of Qin, one man to rule them all. The other states never really saw it coming. Or maybe they did, and just didn't believe it. For centuries, Qin had been dismissed as a frontier power. Tough, disciplined, maybe a little barbaric. But by the mid-200s BCE, they were more than tough. They were efficient, relentless, calculating. They didn't just want land or tribute. They wanted the entire chessboard cleared. And they had the perfect piece to do it. His name was Yingzheng. You might know him by another title, Qin Shi Huangdi, the first emperor of China. But before the crown, he was a teenager ruling a kingdom full of generals and scholars, many of whom thought they were smarter than him. Turns out they weren't. Yingzheng was cunning, paranoid, visionary. He trusted no one, not even his own mother, and built a network of spies and enforcers that would make a modern surveillance state blush. He listened to strategists like Li Si, a legalist thinker who believed order was more important than anything, even human life. Under their rule, Qin didn't just fight, they devoured. From 230 BCE to 221 BCE, one by one, the remaining warring states fell. Han was the first to go. Small, surrounded, vulnerable. Jie resisted fiercely, but the Qin army starved them out. Yan tried to assassinate Yingzheng and paid the price. Wei was trapped between Qin and Chu and crushed. Chu, once mighty, fought hard, but fell in 223 BCE. And finally, Qi, isolated and demoralized, surrendered without a fight. By 221 BCE, it was done. For the first time in history, all of China, the land of 100 warring clans, feudal lords, and philosophical schools, was united under one man. And that man wasted no time making it known. Yingzheng declared himself Shi Huangdi, meaning first emperor, not king, not lord, emperor. Because this wasn't just a new reign, it was a new world. He abolished feudalism, standardized everything: currency weights, axle lengths, on carts. He unified the writing system so people in different regions could finally understand each other. He built roads that stretched across the empire, allowing armies and messages to move with unprecedented speed. And yes, he began work on something that would become legendary: the Great Wall. Not the entire wall we know today, of course, but he connected older fortifications, expanded them, and turned the northern frontier into a massive defense line against the nomadic Xiongnu tribes. Tens of thousands of laborers, many of them prisoners, died during its construction. Some were buried in the wall itself. But Qin Shi Huang didn't stop there. He cracked down on dissent, especially from the Confucians, who valued tradition and moral virtue over obedience and law. In 213 BCE, on the advice of Li Si, He ordered the infamous book burnings, thousands of texts destroyed, and scholars executed or exiled. He didn't want old ideas. He wanted unity, uniformity, control. Even death, it seemed, couldn't stop his ambition. Obsessed with immortality, the emperor sent expeditions to find elixirs of life. He drank mercury-laced potions, built hidden palaces, commissioned the terracotta army, thousands of life-sized soldiers buried near his tomb to protect him in the afterlife. Every one of them with a unique face, a silent eternal legion. But beneath the surface cracks were forming. His reforms were brilliant, but brutal. His taxes were high, his punishments severe. And the common people, those who built his roads, his walls, his empire, were growing restless. Still no one dared defy him. He was the emperor, the son of heaven, untouchable, until he wasn't. In 210 BCE, while traveling on a tour of his empire, Qin Shi Huang died. Some say it was illness. Others whisper it was the very mercury he drank to cheat death. Either way, he didn't get to enjoy his afterlife because what came next was chaos. His son, manipulated by court officials, took the throne. But he wasn't his father. He lacked the vision, the ruthlessness, the force of personality. And in a few short years, the Qin dynasty collapsed. Less than 15 years after it began, the empire that took centuries to build crumbled. But the idea didn't die. The idea that China could be one, that a single emperor could rule not just land, but language, laws, and hearts. That idea, once planted, never went away. So, as you close your eyes tonight, think about that young man from the Qin court. Not a hero, not a villain, just a boy with a plan to bring order to chaos. And in doing so, he reshaped history forever. Sleep well. The emperor is dead, but his dream lives on. The Han Dynasty, silk stars and stability. I once read in a dusty library book, the kind with yellowed pages and that strange smell of time, that if the Qin built the bones of China, then the Han gave it a soul. And I've never forgotten that line. Because after all the brutality, all the legal codes and stone-faced warriors, China was ready for something softer, something more human, and that something was the Han Dynasty. It began in 206 BCE when a man named Liu Bang, a former peasant and minor official, overthrew the Qin. He wasn't born into royalty. He wasn't raised with tutors and calligraphy lessons. He was just clever, charismatic, and maybe most importantly, lucky. Liu Bang took the name Emperor Gaozu, and his dynasty would last over 400 years, one of the longest in Chinese history. And what a history it was. Under the Han, China blossomed. Cities expanded. Roads stretched like veins across the empire. Taxes were lowered. Slavery was reduced. Education became a way up the ladder, especially if you could master the art of Confucian thinking. That's right. Confucius was back. After being shunned by the Qin, Confucianism returned like an old friend. Its ideals, respect, harmony, duty to family and ruler, became the beating heart of Han government. Schools were built. Civil service exams were created. For the first time, you could theoretically work your way into the bureaucracy through knowledge and merit, not just bloodline. And the scholars, oh, they thrived. They studied the stars, recorded eclipses, wrote encyclopedias. One astronomer, Shang, even invented a seismoscope, a device that could detect distant earthquakes. In a world where thunder was still considered a dragon's roar, that was something close to magic. But it wasn't just the mind that flourished. So did the body. The Han pushed their borders outward into Korea, into Vietnam, into the deserts of Central Asia. And with expansion came trade. Now imagine this. You're a Roman merchant in a toga sipping wine near the Mediterranean. And in your hands, silk. Fine glimmering Chinese silk. smooth as water, light as a whisper. You don't know who made it. You don't know where it came from. But it's worth more than gold. That's the Silk Road, or at least the beginning of it. During the Han, a diplomat named Zhang Qian was sent westward to seek allies against the Xiongnu tribes in the north. He didn't find many friends, but he found something else, a world beyond China. His reports brought back news of tall horses, new crops, foreign kingdoms, and slowly trade routes began to form, connecting China to India, to Persia, to Rome. Not just silk went west. Ideas did. Religions did. Buddhism, for example, began seeping into China during this time, carried by monks and travelers along those same roads. Back home, the Han emperors were busy keeping balance. Too much central control. You get rebellion. Too little, you get warlords. So they danced the dance of politics, empowering local nobles, then cutting them down, promoting eunuchs at court, then fearing their influence, marrying off princesses for peace, then watching the treaties fall apart. It wasn't always smooth. There were famines, floods, revolts. One of the most famous came in 9 CE, when a powerful official named Wang Mang seized the throne and declared a new dynasty. He called it the Qin Dynasty New. But it was anything but. Wang Mang tried radical reforms, land redistribution, currency changes, but he misread the times. His reign ended in chaos, and by 23 CE, the Han were back, now called the Eastern Han. The new emperors tried to restore order. Some succeeded, some didn't. Corruption grew. Power slipped from the capital to the provinces. Warlords began carving out their own territories, and once again, the peasants suffered. Then came the Yellow Turban Rebellion. In 184 CE, a massive uprising led by Taoist healers who believed the end of the Han had come. They wore yellow scarves and preached equality, but they were crushed. Still, the damage was done. By the end of the 2nd century, the Han were like a once great ship, still afloat, but full of holes, and behind every noble's smile was a dagger waiting to strike. One of the most famous warlords, a name you might have heard, was Cao Cao. Ambitious, ruthless, brilliant. His campaigns would later be immortalized in the epic romance of the Three Kingdoms, a tale of honor and betrayal that still echoes through Chinese culture today. But before that story unfolds, before the empire truly fractures, the Han deserve one more thought. Because for all their flaws, they laid the cultural foundation of China. The writing system, the sense of identity, the political structure, the deep reverence for learning and family. So much of what people still call Chinese began during the Han. So as you lie back tonight, remember, even after 400 years, even after collapse, the Han were not forgotten. And maybe that's the greatest legacy of all. Not just to rule, but to be remembered. The Three Kingdoms, a nation split. 3 ways. You ever see a beautiful old vase, chipped, cracked, barely holding together, and think it's only a matter of time before it breaks? That was China at the end of the Han Dynasty. By the early 3rd century, the empire wasn't really an empire anymore. Power had shifted. The emperor was more puppet than ruler, and behind the curtain, warlords pulled the strings. One of the most powerful, Cao Cao. Ambitious, clever, feared. He didn't start as royalty. In fact, he was a military man, sharp with a sword and sharper with strategy. He served the Han court, rose through the ranks, and eventually became the de facto ruler of northern China. But he wasn't alone. Other warlords like Sun Quan in the southeast and Liu Bei in the west were carving out kingdoms of their own. Each claimed legitimacy. Each claimed they would restore the old order. But really, they all wanted the same thing: power. And so from around 220 CE, China was split into 3 major kingdoms: Wei ruled by Cao Cao's successors in the north, Wu under the Sun family in the south, Shu led by Liu Bei, and later his son, in the southwest. That's why we call it the Three Kingdoms period. Now I've got to tell you, this era is one of the most romanticized in all of Chinese history. Not romantic like roses and moonlight, but romantic in the epic sense. Think heroic warriors, loyal generals, cunning tricksters. The kind of stories passed down for centuries, embroidered a little more each time they're told. You've got figures like Zhao Yun, the fearless cavalryman, who rode alone into enemy ranks to rescue a baby prince. Or Zhuge Liang, the brilliant strategist known for his wisdom and his eerie calm. Or Guan Yu, the red-faced general who became so iconic, he's now worshipped as a god of loyalty and brotherhood in some Chinese temples. It's a time of battles, huge dramatic clashes, like the Battle of Red Cliffs, where massive fleets set the Yangtze River ablaze. Cao Cao's mighty northern navy was defeated by a combination of fire ships' fog and one of the most famous ambushes in military history. If you've ever seen Chinese war dramas, you've probably seen Red Cliffs, it's that big. But beyond the legends and the heroes, life for ordinary people was hard. There were constant wars, crops burned, cities sacked, refugees flooded the countryside, bandits roamed, famine spread. Imagine trying to raise a family with 3 armies marching back and forth across your village every year. There was no safe place, only shifting borders. The 3 kingdoms balanced each other out for a time. No one had enough power to unify the country, but none were weak enough to fall outright. Then, in 263 CE, the kingdom of Wei conquered Shu, and a few years later, in 280 CE, Jin, a dynasty that rose from the ashes of Wei, conquered Wu. For a brief moment, China was unified again under the Western Jin dynasty. But don't get too excited. The unity didn't last long. The Jin emperors struggled to control their court. Infighting tore the royal family apart. And soon China fractured again, this time into more than just 3 kingdoms. But here's the thing about the Three Kingdoms period. Even though it was short, just about 60 years, it left a huge cultural mark. It's the subject of one of China's 4 great classical novels, Romance of the Three Kingdoms. Written over 1,000 years later, it turned real events into myth and history into legend. Even today, Chinese kids grow up hearing tales of Liu Bei's virtue, Zhuge Liang's genius, and Cao Cao's ambition. Video games, TV shows, comics, they still revisit this period again and again. And maybe that's because in all its chaos, the Three Kingdoms offer something timeless. A story of loyalty and betrayal, hope and heartbreak, unity and division. A reminder that even the mightiest nations can be torn apart by ambition, and maybe, just maybe, stitched back together by the right hands. As you close your eyes tonight, picture the war banners flapping in the wind, the generals riding into battle, the campfires flickering under a red moon. Somewhere out there, the empire still breathes. The Tang Dynasty, a golden age of art and empire. If you were to fall asleep and dream of ancient China at its most majestic silk robes fluttering in the breeze, palaces glowing in lantern light, poems whispered beneath cherry blossoms, odds are you're dreaming of the Tang Dynasty. Because this was the Golden Age. The Tang Dynasty began in 618 CE, founded by Li Yuan, who took the throne as Emperor Gaozu after the fall of the short-lived Sui dynasty. His son Li Shimin, better known as Emperor Taizong, would become one of China's most admired rulers. Wise, strategic, open to criticism, he listened to his advisors, welcomed diverse ideas, and expanded the empire's reach in nearly every direction. Under Taizong and his successors, especially Empress Wu Zetian and Emperor Xuanzong, The Tang court became a place of both power and poetry. Let's pause on that name for a second. Wu Zetian. The only woman in Chinese history to officially rule as emperor in her own right. Not empress, emperor. She wasn't a footnote, she was the headline. Her path to power wasn't clean palace intrigue, rival factions, whispers of ruthlessness. But once in charge, she stabilized. The state promoted capable officials regardless of their background, and backed the arts and education. Some remember her as a tyrant, others as a trailblazer. Either way, she left a mark no one could erase. Tang China was vast. Its borders stretched west into Central Asia, northeast toward Korea, south into Vietnam. Thanks to the Silk Road, its cities became hubs of trade and culture. Foreign merchants brought spices, glassware, and ideas. Buddhist monks carried scriptures from India. Muslim travelers arrived from as far as Persia and Arabia. In the capital city of Chang'an, you could hear 10 languages in a single marketplace. This was a cosmopolitan empire, multicultural, multilingual, mesmerizing. But it wasn't just power and politics. The Tang Dynasty was also a cultural explosion. Poetry wasn't just a hobby, it was a national obsession. Every educated person wrote poems. Poets were celebrities, and none more so than Li Bai and Du Fu. Li Bai was the dreamer. He wrote about the moon wine mountains friendship. Du Fu was the realist. His verses mourned war, poverty, and the fragility of life. They were like Lennon and McCartney, but with ink and rice paper. Even now, school children in China memorize their poems. Some of their lines are as familiar as nursery rhymes. And art, oh the art. This was the age of landscape painting, misty mountains, winding rivers, tiny fishermen in boats beneath towering pines. Artists weren't trying to capture reality exactly. They wanted to capture feeling, that sense of quiet awe you get when standing alone in nature. Music, dance, fashion all flourished. The Tang court loved performance. They hosted grand banquets with music from India, Persia, and beyond. Women wore elaborate hairpieces and flowing dresses. Men sported tall hats and embroidered robes. If you were rich, life could feel like a festival that never ended. But not all was harmony and flute music. In 755 CE, a powerful general named An Lushan rebelled against the Tang court. His uprising shook the empire to its core. Cities burned, millions died. Some say it was the bloodiest war in human history, up to that point. The Tang dynasty survived barely, but it never fully recovered its former glory. Over time, local governors gained more power. Corruption crept into the bureaucracy, and by the late 800s, rebellions flared up like sparks in dry grass. By 907 CE, the Tang dynasty fell. China entered another period of fragmentation, the 5 dynasties and 10 kingdoms era. But even in its decline, the Tang left behind a legacy that glowed like sunset on temple roofs. It showed the world what a Chinese empire could be: open, radiant, bursting with brilliance. And long after the emperors were gone, their poems still floated in the air. So if you're drifting off to sleep tonight, imagine yourself walking through Chang'an at dusk, red lanterns, swaying, the smell of incense in the air, a flute playing softly in the distance. That sound, that's the echo of an empire. The Song Dynasty, Invention, Trade, and the Rise of the Scholar. You ever open a book and see something that feels oddly modern? Like turning the page and finding paper money, gunpowder weapons, or even a mention of a government exam. That's the Song Dynasty for you 1,000 years ago, but full of ideas that sound familiar. The Song Dynasty began in 960 CE, when a general named Zhao Kuangyin seized the throne and became Emperor Taizu. Tired of chaos and warlords, he wanted stability, and he brought it. The dynasty would last for over 300 years, though it would be split into two halves: the Northern Song 960-1127 and the Southern Song 1127-1279. Let's start with what made the Song so different. This wasn't an age of conquering warriors. It was an age of scholars. For the first time in Chinese history, the civil service examination system became the true path to power. Young men, mostly from wealthy families, studied Confucian texts for years. Then they sat for grueling exams, sometimes lasting days. Success meant a ticket into the bureaucracy. Failure meant, well, try again next decade. It wasn't a perfect system, but it was revolutionary. Power no longer came just from bloodline or battlefield victories. It came from the pen, from memory, from the ability to write a good essay on morality. The ideal Chinese official wasn't a sword-wielding general. He was a calm, learned man with a neat beard and a bookshelf full of classics. And while they were studying Confucius, something else was happening. Invention. Lots of it. The Song dynasty was one of the most scientifically advanced societies on Earth. Need a receipt. Use paper money first issued by Song officials to replace bulky coins. Want to check direction. The magnetic compass had been known for a while, but now it was used for navigation. Thinking of printing a book? Try movable type printing, which the Song developed even before Gutenberg's press in Europe. And that's not all. They had advanced clocks, water-powered machinery, and yes, they refined gunpowder. Not for fireworks, but for military use. Flamethrowers, bombs, fire lances. This was a time when China could have launched into an industrial revolution. It didn't, not quite, but the seeds were there. Meanwhile, cities flourished. Take Kaifeng, the capital of the Northern Song, a bustling metropolis of over 1 million people. Markets sold silk, tea books, exotic goods from overseas. Restaurants served dishes from every region. Street performers entertained crowds. Public bathhouses, night markets, even early department stores. This was urban life in the 11th century. Trade wasn't just within China. The Song built massive ocean-going ships and developed maritime trade networks that stretched from Japan to India to the Persian Gulf. Chinese porcelain, silk, and tea were in demand. In return came spices, pearls, ivory, and ideas. It wasn't all perfect, of course. The Song dynasty was often militarily weak. While the scholars debated ethics, northern tribes like the Khitan Liao and Yurchen Jin built powerful states of their own. In 1127, the Jurchen invaded and captured Kaifeng, forcing the Song to retreat south. Thus began the Southern Song, with its new capital in Hangzhou. Now, if you ever want to visit a city that poets fell in love with, it's Hangzhou. Perched on the edge of West Lake, surrounded by hills and pagodas, it was said to be heaven on earth. The Southern Song built canals, grew rice, fostered art. It was smaller than the North and more vulnerable, but it pulsed with culture and creativity. Still, the Song lived with a growing threat. Far to the north, a storm was gathering. A new power, a nomadic people united under a single leader. You might know his name, Genghis Khan. By the early 1200s, the Mongols were conquering across Asia like a wildfire. And the Song knew eventually they would come. But that's for next time. For now, picture a Song scholar in his study brush, in hand, composing a poem by candlelight. Outside, merchants close their stalls, the city quiets, and the moon rises over West Lake. A moment of peace in an age that quietly changed the world. The Mongol conquest, Kublai Khan, and the Yuan dynasty. Have you ever had a dream where everything familiar is still there, but someone else is running the show? That was China in the 1200s. The streets still bustled. The rivers still flowed. The scholars still recited their Confucius. But on the throne sat a man whose ancestors had once lived in tents, chased game on horseback, and never planted rice. A man named Kublai Khan. But let's rewind a bit. The Mongols didn't start out as conquerors. They were nomadic herders, scattered across the steppes of Central Asia. Tough, fast, used to hardship. And then came a leader who changed everything, Temujin, better known to the world as Genghis Khan. In 1206, he united the Mongol tribes. By 1227, he had carved out the largest land empire the world had ever seen. From Korea to Eastern Europe, city after city fell, and after Genghis's death, his descendants kept going. One of them, his grandson Kublai, had his eyes on a bigger prize: China. At the time, the southern Song dynasty still controlled the southern half of the country, but they were no match for the Mongol war machine. It wasn't quick. The conquest took decades. The Mongols had to learn how to fight in river valleys, deal with fortified cities, and use siege weapons. They borrowed engineers from Persia, Muslim cannon makers from Central Asia, and Chinese traders who knew the terrain. Finally, in 1279, after years of brutal warfare, the last Song stronghold fell. Kublai Khan declared the start of a new dynasty, the Yuan. Now here's where it gets strange. Kublai didn't want to rule like a Mongol. He wanted to rule like a Chinese emperor. He moved the capital to what we now call Beijing. He took on a Chinese name, adopted Chinese rituals, and wore Chinese robes. He even tried to revive the old civil service exams, though with a Mongol twist. But Kublai never fully trusted the Confucian scholars. His empire had 4 tiers of people: Mongols at the top, Central Asians and Muslims in the second, Northern Chinese third, Southern Chinese last. It was a caste system, and it bred resentment. Still, Kublai's rule was one of tolerance and openness, at least by the standards of the time. He welcomed foreign travelers. The most famous, a young Venetian named Marco Polo, who arrived in China in the 1270s and spent years at Kublai's court. When he returned to Europe, he described a land of paper currency coal for fuel, grand cities, and vast postal networks. His stories sounded like fantasy, but they were real. Under Yuan rule, China was more connected to the outside world than ever before. The Silk Road boomed, so did maritime trade. Ideas, goods, and even diseases moved along these routes. Yes, including the Black Death, which would later devastate Europe. But for all the wealth and splendor, there were cracks. The Mongols never fully fit in. They spoke a different language, worshipped different gods, preferred meat to rice. And when times got hard, crop failures, floods, plagues, the people turned against them. After Kublai's death in 1294, things went downhill. The later Yuan emperors were weaker, more corrupt. Uprisings simmered, bandits roamed, and by the mid-1300s, a man from a poor peasant family would rise up and bring the dynasty to an end. But that's for next time. So tonight, close your eyes and imagine a foreign emperor in a Chinese palace, gold and jade around him, Persian advisors at his side, a young Italian telling stories by firelight, and outside in the countryside, something old and Chinese waits to return: the rise of the Ming dynasty, red turbans and restored glory. If you've ever cleaned your whole house after a messy guest finally left, you'll understand how the Chinese felt after the fall of the Mongol Yuan dynasty. By the mid-1300s, famine, floods, and plague had devastated the land. The Mongol rulers were out of touch, disconnected from the people they governed. Bandits prowled the countryside. Taxes rose. Morale fell. And out of that chaos came the red turbans. They weren't just rebels. They were part religion, part militia, part movement. Inspired by Buddhist and Taoist teachings and a prophecy that a native Chinese ruler would restore the world, they rallied peasants, farmers, and disillusioned scholars. Their leaders preached about the mandate of heaven that old idea that emperors ruled only with divine approval. And the Mongols, they had lost it. One of the red turban followers was a poor orphan named Zhu Yuanzhang. He had grown up hungry, had wandered as a beggar, lived in a Buddhist monastery for a while, then picked up a sword and joined the rebellion. He was clever, charismatic, and ruthless when he needed to be. Bit by bit, Zhu rose through the ranks, gaining followers, outmaneuvering rivals. And in 1368 he marched into Beijing, drove out the last Mongol emperor, and declared a new dynasty. The Ming. It means brilliant. And for a time it lived up to the name. Zhu Yuanzhang became the Hongwu emperor. And from day one, he made it clear this was going to be a return to Chinese traditions. No more Mongol favoritism. No more foreign hierarchy. Confucian scholars were back in charge. The civil service exams were revived. The capital was moved to Nanjing. And the emperor ruled with an iron grip. He didn't trust bureaucrats, so he kept most power in his own hands. He set up networks of secret police, issued harsh laws, punished corruption with brutality. Some historians say he executed tens of thousands during purges. But he also built. He ordered massive infrastructure projects, canals, dikes, granaries, walls. He wanted to stabilize the countryside, feed the population, and restore dignity to a battered nation. And when he died, the Ming dynasty was firmly in place. His son Yongle would take things even further. He moved the capital to Beijing and began building what would become the Forbidden City, a sprawling palace complex that still stands today, a symbol of imperial majesty and Ming might. And then, he turned outward. While China had long been a land power, Yongle commissioned an extraordinary series of voyages by a Muslim admiral named Zheng He. Between 1405 and 1433, Zheng He led 7 massive expeditions across the Indian Ocean. His fleet included hundreds of ships, some larger than any wooden vessels Europe would build for centuries, and tens of thousands of men. They sailed to Southeast Asia, India, the Arabian Peninsula, and the coast of Africa. But these weren't voyages of conquest. They were about prestige, diplomacy, trade, spreading Chinese influence and bringing back tribute. They brought back exotic animals, spices, and foreign envoys. Imagine giraffes walking through the streets of Nanjing, because that actually happened. But after Yongle's death, the court turned inward again. Conservatives argued the voyages were too expensive, too risky, and in time, China dismantled its great navy, burned the ships, sealed off parts of the coast. The age of exploration ended just as Europe's was beginning. The Ming, now inward-focused, built something else, the Great Wall. Not the original wall, but the version we often picture today. Stone brick watchtowers, most of it was constructed or reinforced during the Ming to defend against northern nomads, like the Mongols. Internally, the Ming dynasty brought stability, population growth, and a flowering of culture. Chinese literature flourished. Novels like Journey to the West and Water Margin were written. Porcelain, white and blue and exquisite, became prized around the world. But like many dynasties, the seeds of decline were planted early. Corruption returned. Eunuchs, once servants in the palace, gained political power, sometimes manipulating emperors. Natural disasters struck. The economy suffered. By the 1600s, peasant uprisings had begun again, and at the edges of the empire, a new threat stirred. A people from the northeast, known as the Manchus, were watching, waiting. But for tonight, let your mind drift to a time of paper fans and silk robes, of grand voyages and golden palaces, of emperors who thought the world revolved around their throne, and for a while, maybe it did. The Qing dynasty, the last empire. If you ever had a neighbor move in who seemed quiet at first, and then slowly took over the whole block, Well, that's kind of how the Qing dynasty came to rule China. By the early 1600s, the Ming dynasty was on its last legs. The court was corrupt, peasants were starving, and rebel armies were marching toward Beijing. In 1644, one such rebel, Li Zicheng, stormed the capital. The Ming emperor hanged himself on a tree near the Forbidden City. It was a dramatic end and a sudden vacuum. And into that vacuum stepped the Manchus. They were a semi-nomadic people from the northeast beyond the Great Wall. Their own rulers had been watching China unravel for years. When the Ming collapsed, a Ming general invited the Manchus in to help restore order. Big mistake. The Manchus marched in, defeated the rebels, and then decided they liked it there. They established the Qing dynasty, and it would be China's last. The Qing faced a challenge from the start. They were outsiders, ethnically and culturally different from the Han majority. So they walked a careful line, adopting Chinese customs and Confucian ideals to win legitimacy, but also keeping their own identity. They required Han men to wear their hair in a queue, a long braid down the back, with the front shaved as a symbol of loyalty. Refusing meant execution. It was a powerful and controversial sign of dominance. But politically, the early Qing emperors were surprisingly competent. The Kangxi emperor, who reigned for over 60 years, starting in 1661, was scholarly, strategic, and deeply curious. He toured the empire, reduced taxes, supported science and learning, and reached out to Jesuit missionaries from Europe, even inviting them into the court for their math and astronomy skills. Then came Emperor Qianlong, Kangxi's grandson, who ruled from 1735 to 1796. Under him, the Qing reached their territorial peak. Tibet, Xinjiang, Taiwan, all brought under firm control. Art and culture flourished. Painting, poetry, opera, the Qing court became a center of elegance. And the emperor himself was a patron and a poet. But even Qianlong had his blind spots. He famously dismissed a British trade envoy led by Lord Macartney in 1793, who had come to open diplomatic relations. Macartney brought gifts, maps, clocks, but refused to perform the full kowtow. And the emperor responded with a polite but firm letter, essentially saying, China needed nothing from the West. That right there was a missed moment. Because while China felt self-sufficient, the West was changing fast, and it would not wait politely. Back at home, problems were mounting. Corruption crept in. Population boomed. Resources stretched thin. And the government, once efficient, grew bloated and slow. But what really shook the Qing was opium. The British, hungry to balance trade, began illegally importing opium into China. By the early 1800s, millions were addicted. Social stability unraveled. Families collapsed. And silver, once flowing in, began flowing out. In 1839, the Chinese government finally cracked down, seizing and destroying massive quantities of British opium in Canton. Britain responded the way empires often did, with warships. The First Opium War ended in humiliating defeat for China. The Treaty of Nanking in 1842 forced the Qing to hand over Hong Kong open ports to foreign trade and grant special rights to British citizens. It was the beginning of what Chinese historians call the Century of Humiliation. More unequal treaties followed. Foreign powers, Britain, France, Germany, Russia, Japan, all carved out spheres of influence. Missionaries arrived. Railroads and telegraph lines were laid, often without local input. China's sovereignty was eroding, one signature at a time. Meanwhile, inside China, fury was growing. The Taiping Rebellion, led by a man who claimed to be the brother of Jesus Christ, erupted in 1850. It became one of the deadliest conflicts in human history, over 20 million dead. The Qing barely survived, relying on regional armies and Western support. Then came the Boxer Rebellion in 1900, a grassroots xenophobic uprising, targeting foreigners and Christians. The Boxers believed they could repel bullets through spiritual rituals. Spoiler, they couldn't. 8 foreign powers joined forces to crush the rebellion and marched straight into Beijing. The Qing were humiliated again, forced to pay massive reparations, forced to bow figuratively and literally to foreign demands. At the same time, reformers were trying to modernize, introducing railways, Western education, new industries. But it was too little too late. In 1911, after centuries of dynasties, revolutions and emperors ruling by the mandate of heaven, the Chinese people said enough. The Xinhai Revolution overthrew the Qing. The last Emperor Puyi was just a boy. He abdicated in 1912. And with that, 2,000 years of imperial rule came to an end. The Republic of China was born fragile, fragmented, hopeful. And the Qing dynasty, once fierce, elegant, and far-reaching, became the final curtain call in China's imperial story. But that story wasn't over. Not by a long shot. The Republic wobbles, warlords chaos, and a nation in pieces. Imagine knocking down the walls of an old crumbling palace expecting to find a solid foundation underneath, only to discover it's all loose dirt and broken stone. That was China after the fall of the Qing dynasty. In 1912, with the abdication of the child Emperor Puyi, the Republic of China was declared. For a brief moment, there was hope. A chance to modernize, to unify, to join the ranks of the world's great powers. And at the center of that hope was Sun Yat-sen, a revolutionary, a physician, and a dreamer. He had a vision of democracy, nationalism, and people's welfare. His 3 principles of the people became the ideological core of the new republic. But dreams are fragile. The truth was, China was not ready. The republic was a name, not yet a system. And power, as always, abhors a vacuum. After Sun Yat-sen stepped down as provisional president hoping to avoid civil war, he handed power to a strong man, Yuan Shikai, a Qing general who had switched sides at just the right moment. At first, Yuan promised stability. Then, in 1915, he declared himself emperor. Yes, emperor. The public outcry was fierce. Provinces rebelled. Even Yuan's allies turned their backs. Within months, he backed down, and a year later, he died. His brief attempt to revive monarchy only shattered what little unity was left. And so began the warlord era. From 1916 to the late 1920s, China was less a country and more a chessboard of competing military cliques. Generals ruled provinces like personal kingdoms. They printed their own money, had their own armies, fought each other over railways, rivers, and opium routes. There was no central authority, just endless backroom deals and shifting alliances. One warlord might pledge allegiance to the national government in Beijing, only to betray it the next week. Another might start as a schoolteacher, rise through the ranks, and carve out a fiefdom through sheer charisma and ruthlessness. And while the generals bickered, the people suffered. Famine, banditry, and constant conflict. Villages caught in crossfire. Cities under siege. Taxes demanded by 5 different armies. Farmers conscripted into wars they didn't understand. Amid the chaos, Sun Yat-sen returned to the political stage, trying once again to build a stable government, this time from Guangzhou, far from the power struggles in the north. But he knew he needed more than ideals. He needed an army, and for that, he needed help. Enter the Soviet Union. The Russians saw an opportunity to influence China and offered support, money, advisors, and strategy. In return, they asked Sun to unite with the Chinese Communists, a small fledgling group formed in 1921, inspired by Marx and Lenin. Sun, ever the pragmatist, agreed. Thus was born the First United Front, an alliance between the Kuomintang KMT Sun's Nationalist Party and the Chinese Communist Party CCP. Together, they trained a new army, the National Revolutionary Army. And in 1926, after Sun's death, a new leader emerged to carry the revolution forward, Chiang Kai-shek. Chiang was no ideologue. He was a military man, strategic, calculating, and not particularly fond of the communists. Still, he led the Northern Expedition, marching from Guangzhou to Beijing to reunify the country and crush the warlords. By 1928, most of China was nominally under one flag again. The warlord era, at least in name, was over, but unity was skin deep. By 1927, Chiang had turned on the communists, purging them in a brutal crackdown known as the Shanghai Massacre. Thousands were killed, the alliance shattered, and the Chinese Civil War began, a conflict that would smolder, flare, and rage for more than 2 decades. So here was China, once again, torn in two. On one side, the nationalists led by Chiang, backed by business elites, Western powers, and much of the traditional establishment. On the other, the communists, now driven underground, scattered to the countryside, led by rising figures like Mao Zedong. Meanwhile, the world was changing. Japan, once a neighbor, now a rising imperial power, was watching closely. In 1931, Japan invaded Manchuria, setting up a puppet state called Manchukuo, with none other than the last Qing Emperor Puyi as its figurehead. China protested. The League of Nations condemned. But no one stopped it. And as Japan dug in deeper, it was clear China's greatest crisis was yet to come. But we'll get there soon. For now, as the sun sets on this chapter, picture a country that had tried to leap forward from emperors to elections, from dynasties to republics, only to stumble into warlords and betrayals. A country still searching for its center, still chasing its future, still not yet whole. The war nobody wanted. Japan invades and China bleeds. If you were a child growing up in China in the 1930s, you might have remembered the sound of airplanes more than lullabies. Because by the time the decade was halfway through, war wasn't a fear. It was a daily fact of life. It officially began on July 7, 1937, at the Marco Polo Bridge just outside Beijing. A Japanese soldier went missing during a night training exercise. The Japanese army, already stationed in northern China, demanded to search a nearby Chinese town. The Chinese refused. Shots were fired. What should have been a small scuffle exploded into something much bigger. The Second Sino-Japanese War had begun. But the truth is, it didn't start there. Japan had already taken Manchuria back in 1931, using a staged railway explosion as a pretext. They had set up a puppet government, installed the last Qing Emperor Puyi as a figurehead, and renamed the region Manchukuo. The world condemned it. But no one acted, and emboldened by that silence, Japan pushed further. By 1937, they wanted more land, more resources, more control. China, meanwhile, was still torn apart. Nationalists and communists were fighting their civil war. Warlords still held sway in some provinces. The country was weak, divided, and vulnerable. But war has a way of uniting enemies, for a while at least. In 1937, the KMT and the CCP agreed to put aside their differences, not because they suddenly liked each other, but because they both knew Japan was the bigger threat. Chiang Kai-shek led the nationalist forces, still the primary government of China. Mao Zedong, tucked away in the mountains with the communists, agreed to coordinate resistance. But unity on paper didn't mean unity on the ground. Japan launched a full invasion, first into Beijing, then Shanghai, then the ancient capital Nanjing. And what happened in Nanjing still haunts history. In December 1937, Japanese troops entered the city. For the next 6 weeks, the world witnessed what would later be called the Rape of Nanjing. An estimated 300,000 people, civilians, and disarmed soldiers were murdered. Tens of thousands of women were raped. Homes burned, bodies dumped in rivers. It wasn't just a massacre, it was an atrocity. International journalists, missionaries, and even some diplomats who remained in the city documented it. They set up a safety zone that saved thousands, but they couldn't stop the horror. China, stunned and grieving, still had to fight on. Chiang Kai-shek moved the nationalist capital to Chongqing, deep in the mountains where it was harder for the Japanese to reach. But that didn't stop the bombs. For years, Japanese planes pounded Chongqing with relentless air raids. Markets, schools, hospitals. No place was safe. Meanwhile, Japan kept pushing south and east, taking city after city. But China never fully collapsed, partly because it was huge, partly because the people resisted with grit that surprised even their own leaders. Guerrilla warfare, sabotage, underground newspapers, hidden radios, and partly because Japan overstretched. They controlled cities, but not always the countryside, railways, but not the roads. They tried to break China's will, but underestimated its endurance. The communists in particular grew stronger during this period. While the nationalists bore the brunt of direct fighting, the Red Army embedded itself in rural communities, organizing peasants, building local governments, and winning hearts in a way that would matter later. In 1941, everything changed again. Pearl Harbor. The United States entered World War II, and suddenly China wasn't fighting alone anymore. America, Britain, and the Allies now saw China as a vital partner in the war against Japan. Weapons advisors and aid flowed in. American pilots, the Flying Tigers, began assisting in the skies. Chiang Kai-shek became a global figure, even meeting Roosevelt and Churchill in Cairo in 1943. But inside China, the old cracks remained. The alliance between the KMT and CCP was hanging by threads. Suspicion ran deep. There were skirmishes even during the war, and both sides knew when Japan fell, the Civil War would rise again. Still, for a moment, they had a common cause. In 1945, after years of brutality, bombing, and famine, it finally ended. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima, and Nagasaki forced Japan to surrender. Victory. But it came at a price. 15 to 20 million Chinese lives lost, cities destroyed, infrastructure in ruins, and a political map more fragile than ever. The nationalists were exhausted. Corruption had spread. Their hold on the people had weakened. The communists, meanwhile, were stronger than ever. They had expanded their territories, built loyalty, waited patiently. The war against Japan had ended, but China's next war was just around the corner, and this time it would be for the soul of the nation itself. Civil War and the Rise of Mao. The Japanese were gone. For the first time in years, Chinese cities weren't filled with the hum of enemy planes. People stepped cautiously into the streets, looking around, as if peace itself might vanish if they moved too fast. But that peace, it didn't last long, because even as the last Japanese soldiers left Chinese soil, the two forces that had fought them, the nationalists and the communists, turned back toward each other. It was like a pause button had been released, and the war that had once been shelved came roaring back. Chiang Kai-shek still led the Kuomintang, or KMT, the Nationalist Party. He had international support, especially from the United States. His capital was in Nanjing, and on paper he was still the leader of China. Mao Zedong, meanwhile, had been waiting. His Communist Party had grown quietly and steadily during the war against Japan. They had set up shadow governments in rural areas, built schools, trained militias, organized peasants. They didn't just survive, they prepared. Now it was time to move. In 1946, just a year after the victory over Japan, the Chinese Civil War reignited with a vengeance. At first, it seemed the nationalists had the upper hand. They had more troops, more foreign weapons. They controlled most of the major cities, the railways, the factories. But something deeper was missing. The people. The nationalist army was tired. Corruption was rampant. Supplies often disappeared before they reached the front. Morale was low. Meanwhile, the communists were fighting on familiar ground. The countryside, the mountains, the villages. They used guerrilla tactics won over farmers and painted the nationalists as elitist, disconnected, and cruel. Bit by bit, the tide turned. The Huaihai campaign in late 1948 was a turning point. Hundreds of thousands of troops clashed in central China. And when it was over, the nationalist forces were shattered. In 1949, the end came swiftly. Communist troops marched into Beijing peacefully. Then Shanghai fell. Then Nanjing. And on October 1, 1949, in Tiananmen Square, Mao Zedong stood before a massive crowd and declared, "The Chinese people have stood up." The People's Republic of China was born. Chiang Kai-shek, defeated and surrounded, fled to the island of Taiwan, taking with him his government gold reserves and many loyal soldiers and families. He vowed to return. But that day never came. Back on the mainland, Mao and the Communist Party began to reshape China from the ground up. They called it a revolution. Not just in politics, but in every corner of life. Landlords were stripped of property. Land was redistributed to peasants. Class enemies were identified, humiliated, sometimes executed in public struggle sessions. The goal was to erase old hierarchies, to build a new kind of society. There was hope in those early days. Factories opened. Schools were built. Women for the first time were given legal equality, at least on paper. Foot binding was banned, child marriage outlawed, and for many, it felt like a fresh start. But it also came with fear, because revolution never sleeps. Mao believed that to build a new world, the old one had to be torn down. Completely. And if that meant pain, so be it. Throughout the 1950s, China changed rapidly. The economy was nationalized, private businesses were seized, the press was controlled, and dissent was not just discouraged, it was punished. But still, people adapted, endured, believed, until one campaign would change everything. One idea, one slogan that promised paradise and delivered something else entirely. But that story, the story of the Great Leap Forward, belongs to tomorrow night. So for now, close your eyes. The war has ended. The red flags are flying. And a new China, uncertain and bold, is beginning to dream. The Great Leap Forward, a dream that starved millions. Mao believed in movements, not just political ones. Movements of the soul, of the nation. Sweeping efforts to remake China overnight, to pull it into a new century with the force of collective will. And in 1958, he launched his boldest one yet. It was called The Great Leap Forward. The idea on paper was breathtaking. China would rapidly industrialize. It would outpace the West in steel production. It would become self-sufficient in food. And all of it would be done without capitalism. No factories owned by the rich, no loans from foreign banks, just the power of the people. The countryside would become the engine. Millions of peasants were organized into people's communes, massive collective farms where everything was shared. Homes, tools, kitchens, even children were raised in communal nurseries. The state set impossible quotas for steel and grain, and people eager to prove themselves faked the numbers. One village would report record harvests. The next would feel pressure to match it or beat it. Grain was taken away by the state based on those inflated reports. And soon, there was nothing left. But no one said it aloud. Because to criticize the plan was to criticize the revolution. And to criticize the revolution was dangerous. In some villages, people were still melting down pots and pans in backyard furnaces, trying to meet absurd steel quotas with whatever scrap metal they could find. Meanwhile, the rice bowls were empty. There were whispers of bark being boiled for soup, of mud cakes eaten to fill the stomach, of parents watching children fade. The worst-hit provinces, Henan, Anhui, Sichuan, became silent graveyards. By the time the famine ended, at least 30 million people had died. Some estimates say more than World War I, more than the Holocaust. And yet for years, it was hardly spoken of, because Mao never admitted failure. In public, he called the Great Leap a success with problems. In private, he blamed local officials, bad weather, or foreign sabotage. But the truth was darker. And everyone from the lowest farmer to the highest party member knew it. Still, there was no apology, no reckoning, no turning back. China staggered forward, wounded but silent. And in the early 1960s, something curious happened. Mao stepped back. He let other leaders like Liu Shaoqi and Deng Xiaoping take over daily management. They quietly scaled down the communes, reopened small markets, allowed a bit of breathing room. For a brief moment, it felt like things might heal. But Mao was watching. He didn't like what he saw. He feared the revolution was slipping, that the party was drifting toward moderation, bureaucracy. Even he dared to think capitalism. So he sharpened his next weapon, a storm of youth, of slogans, of chaos. It would be called the Cultural Revolution. The Cultural Revolution, Red Guards and Ruins. It began with a poster, just a handwritten sign pasted to the wall at Peking University in 1966. It denounced school officials as bourgeois revisionists, a small act, but it exploded like a firecracker in a dry field. Mao had returned, not just as a leader, but as a symbol of purity, of revolution, of unyielding truth. He called on the youth to rise up, to smash the old, to expose the enemies hiding in plain sight. He said, bombard the headquarters, and the students listened. They called themselves the Red Guards. Teenagers with armbands and notebooks roaming the streets looking for signs of corruption, elitism, or Western thinking. They marched into schools pulling teachers from classrooms. They shaved the heads of people wearing bourgeois hairstyles. They broke violins, burned books, smashed temples. Not even family was safe. Sons turned in fathers. Daughters denounced mothers. Because the revolution came first. Anything old customs, old culture, old habits, old ideas had to go. It was called the Four Olds Campaign. But it didn't stop at ideas. It tore into people's lives, homes, and memories. Ancient artifacts were destroyed. Entire libraries were reduced to ash. Cemeteries were ransacked. Even Confucius, the most revered philosopher in Chinese history, was declared an enemy. Mao watched from above as chaos spread. At times he encouraged it. At times he stepped back, letting the madness devour its own children. By 1967, China was in a state of near anarchy. Factories stopped. Schools closed. Cities fought cities. Red Guard groups began fighting each other, each claiming to be the true defenders of Mao's thought. The military stepped in, but not to restore peace, to choose sides. And through it all, millions of lives were uprooted. Intellectuals were sent to the countryside for re-education. Professors digging ditches, doctors planting rice, writers silenced forever. Deng Xiaoping, remember him. The pragmatist who tried to fix the economy after the Great Leap was purged again. Labeled a capitalist roader, Liu Shaoqi Once Mao's second-in-command was tortured, denied medicine, and died in prison. No one was untouchable. Except Mao. His portrait loomed over Tiananmen Square. His little red book, a collection of quotes, was held up like scripture. You could be beaten for not memorizing it, or for not quoting it with enough passion. Mao was more than a man. He was a myth, and myths don't apologize. But underneath the slogans and marches, something was breaking. An entire generation grew up without school, without trust, without the comfort of stability. Parents whispered their pain at night, afraid the walls might hear. And then, slowly, it began to wind down. By 1969, Mao called in the army to rein in the Red Guards. Millions of youths were sent down to rural villages to live among peasants not as punishment, but as revolution in action. But it was exile. For many, it lasted a decade. The Cultural Revolution continued in fits and starts through the early 1970s. But the fervor faded. The chaos cooled, and Mao, older now, more isolated, began to retreat. He had one final act left, and in 1976 it came, the death of Mao and the end of an era. He was 82, and for most Chinese people, Mao Zedong had always been there, like a mountain in the distance or the North Star in the sky, unmoving, eternal, above the world. But on September 9, 1976, the mountain finally fell. Mao died in Beijing just past midnight. The official cause was a series of heart attacks. But the truth was simpler. Time had caught him. Even revolutionaries grow old. China paused. Factories stopped. Trains sounded their horns. People wept in the streets, some out of love, others out of habit, and some because they didn't know what else to do. When a god dies, what happens next? Mao's portrait hung over Tiananmen Square. It still does. But his era, his storm of slogans and struggle was quietly being folded up and put away. Behind the scenes, power shifted. There was no clear plan. Mao had named Hua Guofeng as his successor, a loyal bureaucrat known more for obedience than vision. He gave Hua a cryptic endorsement. With you in charge, I am at ease. But few believed Hua had what it took to lead China through what came next. Meanwhile, 4 others were waiting in the wings, the Gang of 4. Led by Mao's last wife, Jiang Qing, they were radicals who had driven much of the Cultural Revolution's chaos. For a moment, it looked like they might seize control, but China was tired. Tired of chaos, of purges, of being told to fight shadows. And in October 1976, just a month after Mao's death, the Gang of 4 were arrested in a sudden silent operation. No riots, no speeches, just gone. It was the quietest revolution China had ever seen. A door closed, and another creaked open. From exile, a familiar face returned, Deng Xiaoping. If Mao was fire, Deng was water. If Mao built dreams from ideology, Deng built them from numbers. He believed in results in rice bowls, factory output, paved roads. He didn't care if the cat was black or white, as long as it caught mice. And starting in 1978, Deng began to reshape China. He opened the door. Literally, he called it reform and opening up. Private businesses were allowed again. Farmers could sell crops. Foreign investment came in. Special economic zones popped up along the coast, places like Shenzhen, which went from fishing village to megacity in a single generation. For the first time in decades, Chinese people could choose their jobs, start companies, visit relatives, speak a little more freely, just a little. It wasn't democracy, but it was movement. The iron grip of ideology loosened just enough to let the market in. People began buying bicycles, televisions, even refrigerators. A middle class began to form. The air smelled different, a little more hopeful, a little more ambitious. But Deng never gave up control. Political reform was off the table. The Communist Party still ruled, still watched, still decided. It was a deal prosperity for obedience. And most people took the deal. After all, the past had shown them what happened when ideology trumped bread. They remembered the famine, the struggle sessions, the fear. So they looked forward. Deng traveled abroad to America, to Japan, wearing a suit, shaking hands, promising China would modernize. He smiled but kept his cards close. By the mid-1980s, China was changing fast. Skyscrapers rose. University students debated economics. TV shows from Hong Kong and Taiwan snuck in through fuzzy antennas. But with new prosperity came new questions. Why can't we vote? Why are some people rich while others are still poor? Why are we told what to think? And in the next chapter of our story, those questions will rise, and the answer, when it comes, will echo across the world. But for now, rest. The old guard has passed. The door has opened. Tiananmen Square and the price of progress. It started with a death, not Mao's. That chapter had closed. This was Hu Yaobang, a former leader who had once tried to bring reform, only to be quietly pushed aside. He was known for listening, for caring about students, for being just a little too soft for the hard edges of power. When he died in April 1989, students in Beijing gathered to mourn. But their mourning turned into something else. It began with candles, poems, portraits, then banners, then demands. They wanted dialogue, anti-corruption laws, press freedom. Some whispered the word democracy, carefully like a match in the wind. And all of this took place in the heart of China, Tiananmen Square, that vast open plaza beneath Mao's portrait. At first, the government hesitated. Some officials urged patience, others called for force, and the students stayed. More came. By May, over 1 million people filled the square. Students, workers, intellectuals, even party members. Some fasted, others sang. They built a statue, the goddess of democracy, white proud, facing the portrait of Mao like a silent question. What do we stand for now? Cameras captured it all. CNN, BBC. The world was watching. And then the soldiers came. On the night of June 3rd to 4th, tanks rolled into Beijing. Gunfire cracked the silence. The square was cleared. We still do not know how many died. The official number is in the hundreds. Others say thousands. Some vanished without a trace. Some were jailed. Some fled abroad. And then silence. The footage was scrubbed, mentions erased, books banned. Even the name Tiananmen became dangerous, but not forgotten, not by those who were there. I once met a man quietly over tea who had marched in that square. He didn't speak of politics, just of the songs, the candles, the hope, and the moment he knew it was over when he saw the tanks and realized they weren't stopping for the party. Tiananmen was a line in the sand. It would allow markets but not dissent. It would offer prosperity but not pluralism. It would bend economically but not break. And so the 1990s became a strange paradox. On the surface, China blossomed. Cities like Shanghai turned into neon jungles. Millions rose out of poverty. Western brands arrived. McDonald's, Nike, Hollywood films dubbed in Mandarin. There was wealth and pride and ambition. But beneath it, a quiet tension. A deal had been struck. As long as the party delivered growth, the people would not ask questions. And the party delivered. Under Jiang Zemin, and later Hu Jintao, China joined the World Trade Organization. It became the factory of the world. Entire cities were built in months. Trains ran faster. Skylines changed yearly. They called it the China Miracle. But it came with cost, pollution, inequality, censorship, and something harder to name, a kind of spiritual pause, as if the country had learned not to look too deeply. I remember visiting in the early 2000s, standing at a market in Guangzhou, watching a child recite multiplication tables while his grandmother sold fake watches. He dreamed of being an engineer. She dreamed of him leaving. Everyone was building towards something, but no one could quite say what. And looming behind it all was that square, that silence. Tiananmen had not been erased, just buried. Yet even buried things leave roots. And in the final part of our story, those roots will grow into something new, a new face, a new era, one that would push China forward and raise new questions not just for China, but for the entire world. Xi Jinping and the new China. And now we come to the China of today. The China you've seen in the headlines, the one with skyscrapers that seem to appear overnight, bullet trains faster than sound apps that run your entire life, and a face. Xi Jinping that now defines this era. Xi did not appear suddenly. He rose through the ranks slowly, deliberately. A princeling, the son of a revolutionary hero, shaped by privilege but also by purges and exile. When he took power in 2012, some hoped he would be a quiet reformer. Instead, he became something else, a symbol of consolidation. Corruption. He cracked down hard. Dissent. He erased it. Hong Kong reined in. Censorship strengthened. The internet tightly watched. The party elevated above all else. And Xi himself declared core leader. Abolished term limits. Placed into textbooks while still alive. For many in China, life is better than ever. There's order, clean cities, ambition, national pride, a sense that China has stood up as Mao once promised. But there's also something else, something quieter. An anxiety, a tightening. Voices once loud have gone silent. Ideas once open now tread carefully. And the world watches with admiration, caution, even fear. Some ask, is this the final form of the Chinese dream? Others wonder what price must be paid to keep it, but you have followed this journey from the Yellow River to WeChat, from emperors to engineers, from dynasties to data, and maybe, just maybe, as you drift into sleep, you'll carry a new image of China, not just as headlines or politics or power, but as a story, a long, winding, often contradictory story of people who loved, lost, dreamed, built, burned, and began again, just like the rest of us. Thank you for listening, and wherever you are, good night.